Dust hung heavy in the stifling Arizona air as a rusted diner bell chimed, announcing the arrival of 8 full-patched Hell's Angels. For Stella, a waitress desperately hiding from her past, the only priority was keeping her 4-year-old daughter Lily invisible in the back booth. But children are fearlessly curious. When Lily wandered over to the most intimidating biker, pointing a tiny finger at his scarred forearm, the diner's ambient clatter vanished. "My dad has the same tattoo," she said cheerfully. Those 8 simple words didn't just stop a hardened biker gang in their tracks, they unraveled a massive 5-year-old lie, exposing a dangerous phantom everyone in the underworld thought was buried deep beneath the Nevada desert. The mid-July sun over Kingman, Arizona was unforgiving, baking the asphalt of Route 66 until the air above it shimmered like water. Inside the copper skillet, a rundown diner situated just off the main drag. The air conditioning unit was fighting a losing battle. The place smelled of burnt filter coffee, old grease, and the faint metallic scent of ozone that always preceded a desert thunderstorm. Stella wiped down the Formica counter for the 4th time that hour, her hands moving mechanically. At 29, she looked older, her face lined with the chronic, exhausting anxiety of a woman who spent every waking second looking over her shoulder. 5 years ago, she had been someone else entirely. She had lived in a high-rise in Seattle, engaged to a man who promised her the world, only to realize too late that his world was built on blood, extortion, and terrifying secrets. When things went wrong, she ran. She ran until her money ran out, stranding her in this dusty purgatory with a secret of her own, her 4-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily was currently sitting in booth 6, safely tucked away behind a partition. She was furiously coloring a picture of a purple horse, her small legs kicking back and forth beneath the table. She was the only pure thing in Stella's life, an innocent anchor in a sea of paranoia. "Order up, Stella," grunted Gary, the diner's perpetually sweating line cook, slamming a plate of rubbery eggs onto the pass. Stella nodded, grabbing the plate, but before she could turn around, a low, guttural rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It started as a distant hum, and quickly escalated into a deafening roar. Coffee in the glass pots trembled. The sheer volume of the approaching engines was physical, vibrating in Stella's chest. She glanced out the greasy front window and felt her stomach drop into her shoes. 8 Harrison-Davidson motorcycles, heavily modified and gleaming in the harsh sun, pulled into the gravel parking lot in a tight, disciplined formation. They killed their engines almost simultaneously, the sudden silence heavier and more oppressive than the noise. The men dismounting were giants clad in heavy denim and worn leather. On the back of their cuts, the infamous death hit logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club stared blindly toward the diner. Below the skull, the bottom rocker read, "Nevada." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Stella's veins. Nevada. That was too close. New. "Get back to the kitchen," Stella hissed to Gary, who was already retreating toward the stockroom. The front door opened, the rusted bell jingling weakly, a pathetic sound against the sheer physical presence of the men entering. They moved with the casual, terrifying confidence of apex predators. They didn't just walk into the room, they occupied it. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His cut identified him as Jim Henderson, though the patches indicated he held the rank of president. He had a thick, graying beard and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Flanking him was Tommy Davis, a wiry, restless man with knuckles so heavily scarred they looked deformed. But it was the third man who made Stella's breath catch in her throat. Albert Pendleton. His road name, stitched onto his leather vest, was simply Ghost. He was taller than the rest, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a face completely devoid of expression. His eyes were a pale, icy blue, and they swept over the empty diner, lingering for a fraction of a second on the partition hiding booth 6. "Just coffee," Jim Henderson rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, addressing Stella without looking at her. "And whatever. Pie is fresh." "Yes, sir," Stella managed to squeak out. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Take any booth you like." The 8 men claimed the 2 largest booths in the center of the diner, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. They spoke in low, hushed tones, the kind of quiet that suggested violence rather than peace. Stella grabbed 2 fresh pots of coffee and a stack of thick ceramic mugs, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "Just serve them. Keep your head down. Don't look them in the eye. They don't know you." She glanced toward booth 6. Lily was still occupied, oblivious to the sudden, suffocating tension in the room. "Stay there, baby. Just stay right there." Pouring coffee for the Hells Angels felt like disarming a bomb blindfolded. Stella moved from cup to cup, her hands trembling just enough to make the dark liquid slosh dangerously close to the rims. Up close, the men smelled of exhaust fumes, stale tobacco, and old leather. They were discussing a recent run near the border, their language coded but heavy with unspoken implications. Ghost sat at the end of the table, closest to the aisle. It was sweltering in the diner, and he had unbuttoned the cuffs of his flannel shirt, rolling the thick material up to his elbows to beat the heat. "You're shaking, sweetheart," Tommy Davis noted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as Stella filled his mug. "We ain't gonna bite, unless you charge for it." A few of the men chuckled darkly. Stella forced a tight, polite smile. "Just a lot of caffeine today. Sorry." She moved to Ghost. He didn't look up, merely tapped his empty mug with a massive, silver-ringed finger. As Stella leaned over to pour, her eyes involuntarily fell upon the exposed flesh of his left forearm. It wasn't a standard club tattoo. It wasn't the death head or a traditional biker slogan. It was a crude, faded, hand-poked piece of prison ink. It depicted a weeping angel, its wings heavily shadowed in black ink, chained tightly to a rusted ship's anchor. Woven into the links of the chain were tiny, barely legible numbers. The 9th of April, 2008. It was a dark, depressing piece of art, screaming of loss and confinement. Stella quickly looked away, finishing the pour. She turned back toward the counter to grab their pies, letting out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. And then she heard the sound. Thump. Roll. A bright red crayon had tumbled off the table of booth 6, bouncing across the linoleum floor and rolling straight down the main aisle. Stella froze. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. From behind the partition, a tiny figure emerged. Lily, wearing her faded denim overalls and a bright yellow t-shirt, scrambled out of her booth to chase her runaway crayon. Her blonde hair fell in messy curls around her face. "Lily, no," Stella whispered, the words dying in her throat. She dropped the pie knife, practically launching herself from behind the counter, but she was too far away. Lily chased the crayon right up to the heavy, steel-toed boots of Albert Ghost Pendleton. The crayon tapped against the leather of his boot and stopped. The conversation among the 8 bikers instantly ceased. 8 pairs of hardened, unforgiving eyes locked onto the tiny 4-year-old girl standing in their midst. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the frantic rattling of the air conditioner. Ghost slowly looked down at the child standing by his knee. His pale blue eyes were unreadable. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared. Lily, entirely unbothered by the giant men surrounding her, bent down and picked up her red crayon. She stood back up, clutching it in her small fist. Instead of running back to her booth, she looked at the men. She looked at their leather vests, their heavy rings, and then, her bright green eyes landed on Ghost's bare left forearm, resting on the table. She stepped closer, leaning in with the complete lack of boundaries only a toddler possesses. "Lily, come here right now!" Stella finally screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror as she ran down the aisle. But Lily didn't look at her mother. She pointed her small, crayon-stained finger directly at the weeping angel chained to the anchor on Ghost's arm. She smiled a wide, missing-tooth smile, delighted by her discovery. "My daddy has that exact same picture on his arm," she said. Her voice was loud, clear, and echoed in the dead-quiet diner. "He showed me." If the silence before had been tense, the silence that followed was apocalyptic. Ghost stopped breathing. The blood physically drained from his face, leaving his tanned skin a sickly, ashen gray. Next to him, Jim Henderson slowly sat up straight, the casual demeanor instantly vanishing, replaced by a rigid, terrifying alertness. Tommy Davis lowered his coffee mug, his hand suddenly perfectly steady. The 8 bikers froze, They didn't just stop moving, they looked as though they had been struck by lightning. Stella grabbed Lily by the shoulders, violently yanking the child back and pressing her face into her apron. "I am so sorry," Stella babbled frantically, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "She's just a kid, she makes things up, she doesn't know what she's saying. I'm sorry. Please." She tried to back away, tried to retreat to the safety of the kitchen, but a massive hand shot out. Ghost grabbed Stella's wrist. His grip wasn't tight enough to bruise, but it was solid, an immovable clamp of bone and muscle. "Wait," Ghost whispered. His voice was hoarse, sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. He didn't look at Stella. He was staring directly at the top of Lily's blonde head. "Please let me go," Stella begged, tears springing to her eyes. "Please." Ghost slowly stood up. He towered over her, casting a massive shadow that completely swallowed Stella and her daughter. He ignored Stella completely, dropping to one knee so he was eye level with the little girl huddled in her mother's apron. "Hey there, little bird," Ghost said, his voice dropping to a surprisingly gentle, trembling whisper. "Can you look at me for a second?" Lily peeked out from the apron. Ghost held out his left arm, tapping the weeping angel with a thick finger. "You said your daddy has this picture?" Lily nodded. "Uh-huh, on his arm, just like that. But his has a big scratch right here." She reached out and traced a line through the angel's wing on Ghost's arm. Ghost closed his eyes. A muscle in his jaw feathered wildly. When he opened his eyes again, they were entirely different. The coldness was gone, replaced by a storm of violent disbelief and burning desperation. "What is your daddy's name, sweetheart?" Ghost asked. "Don't answer him, Lily!" Stella shrieked, panic completely overriding her survival instincts. She shoved Ghost's shoulder with her free hand, a futile gesture against a man his size. "Leave her alone! We don't know anything!" Jim Henderson stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. With a single flick of his chin, Tommy Davis and another biker immediately moved. They didn't draw weapons, but they didn't have to. Tommy walked to the front door of the diner, casually flipped the open sign to closed, and slid the heavy deadbolt into place with a resounding clack. The other biker moved to the hallway, blocking the kitchen and the back exit. They were trapped. "Sit down, lady," Jim Henderson ordered, his voice echoing in the confined space. It wasn't a suggestion. Stella's knees gave out. She collapsed into the nearest booth, pulling Lily into her lap, wrapping her arms around the child like a human shield. She was hyperventilating, her vision swimming with dark spots. This was it. The nightmare she had been outrunning for 5 years had finally caught her in a dusty diner on Route 66. Ghost didn't return to his seat. He remained kneeling in the aisle, sliding closer to Stella's booth. He looked at Stella now, and the intensity in his gaze was terrifying. "I'm going to ask you once, and you are going to tell me the absolute, God-honest truth," Ghost said, every syllable dripping with a dangerous, quiet authority. "Who is the father of this child?" "His name is Mark," Stella lied, sobbing openly now. "Mark Stevens. He's an accountant in Phoenix." She's confused. "It's just a tattoo. A lot of people have angels." "Stop," Ghost interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but it cut through her panic like a razor blade. He pulled up his sleeve further, exposing the full piece. "This isn't flash art from a parlor lady. This was done with a melted guitar string and a battery pack in the solitary confinement wing of Pelican Bay State Prison. It's a blood oath." He pointed to the tiny numbers woven into the chain. "The 9th of April, 2008. April 9th, 2008, Ghost said, his voice cracking slightly. "The night the Aryan Brotherhood tried to take our block. 2 men stood back to back in the showers and fought off a dozen guys with shivs. We bled out on the tiles together. We got this ink 3 weeks later to remember it." Ghost leaned in so close, Stella could feel the heat radiating off him. "Only 2 men in the entire world have this tattoo. One of them is me. The other is Jonathan David Riley." Hearing his full name spoken aloud for the first time in 5 years felt like a physical blow to Stella's chest. All the air left her lungs. She stared at Ghost, her mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. "Jonathan Riley," Jim Henderson repeated from the table, his face a mask of shock. "Ghost, that's impossible. Johnny's been dead for 5 years." "I saw the body burn," Tommy Davis added from the door, his voice lacking its usual sneer. I pulled him from the wreck myself. Ghost. There was nothing left. Then how the hell does a 4-year-old girl in Kingman, Arizona, know about a secret tattoo that was buried in a closed casket in Nevada? Ghost roared, finally losing his composure. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the coffee cups jump. He whipped his head back to Stella. Is it him? Is Jonathan Riley the father of this girl? Stella squeezed her eyes shut. The gig was up. There was no more running. If she lied now, these men would tear the diner apart, and then they would tear her apart. Slowly, trembling uncontrollably, Stella nodded her head. Yes, she whispered. A collective gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock, went around the room. Hardened criminals, men who had seen and done unspeakable things, looked as though they had just seen a dead man walking. You're lying, Ghost breathed, though his eyes begged her to be telling the truth. Johnny died in a cartel ambush outside Vegas. He took a bullet meant for the club. The car went up in flames. He didn't die, Stella sobbed, clutching Lily tighter. He staged it. He had to. Staged it? Jim Henderson took a step forward, his massive frame looming over the booth. Why the hell would Johnny fake his own death? He was my vice president. He was our brother. Because he found out the truth, Stella spat. A sudden surge of defensive anger cutting through her fear. He found out who was really leaking the gun-running routes to the feds. It wasn't the cartel. It was someone inside your chapter. Someone at the very top table. The diner went dead silent again. The implication of her words was high treason in the motorcycle club world. Jonathan knew if he brought it to the club, it would start a civil war, Stella continued, the words spilling out rapidly now that the dam was broken. He knew whoever was the rat would just kill him to keep him quiet. He found out I was pregnant. He told me he loved me. He told me to pack my bags, and he told me to disappear. 2 days later, the news said he died in a fiery crash. Ghost stood up slowly, rubbing his scarred face with trembling hands. He's alive. That stubborn son of a bitch is actually alive. He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with wide, innocent eyes. This is Johnny's kid. Where is he? Jim Henderson demanded, his voice suddenly sharp, dangerous. If he's alive, where is he hiding? Stella looked up at the towering president, a profound sense of doom settling over her. I don't know, she whispered truthfully. He told me he would find us when it was safe, but it's been 5 years. Suddenly, Lily tugged on Stella's apron. Mommy? She piped up, completely oblivious to the lethal tension surrounding her. Daddy isn't hiding. He was here yesterday. He said, he's coming back for dinner. Every biker in the room drew their weapons simultaneously. The metallic snick of switchblades and the heavy clack of handguns being racked filled the air. If Jonathan Riley was coming to dinner, the ghosts of the past weren't just alive. They were walking right through the front door. The metallic chorus of firearms being readied shattered the suffocating heat of the diner. 8 men, conditioned by decades of violence and paranoia, reacted on pure instinct. In a fraction of a second, the copper skillet transformed from a dusty roadside pit stop into a heavily fortified bunker. Stella screamed, wrapping her body entirely over Lily, pressing the little girl into the vinyl upholstery of the booth. Lily, finally sensing the absolute terror radiating from her mother, began to wail, a high-pitched sound that cut through the heavy silence. "Guns down!" Ghost bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. He stood up, placing his massive frame directly between the booth and the drawn weapons of his brothers. "Put them down, damn it! There's a kid in the line of fire!" Jim Henderson didn't lower his Colt .45. His eyes, cold and calculating, remained fixed on the diner's front door. "If Johnny is alive, and he's coming here, this is a trap," the president growled. "He set us up, Ghost. He lured us here to finish the job he started 5 years ago. Tommy, check the perimeter. Check the kitchen. Nobody comes within 100 yards of this building without catching lead." Tommy Davis, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning, nodded sharply. He gripped his 9mm tightly and moved toward the back, kicking the kitchen doors open. The muffled sounds of Gary the line cook, whimpering in the supply closet, echoed faintly. "Jim, think about this," Ghost pleaded, keeping his hands open and visible. "If he wanted us dead, why would he send a 4-year-old girl to point out my ink? Look at this woman. Look at her." He pointed down at Stella, who was trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. "She's terrified. She didn't know we were coming. This is a coincidence. A blind, 1,000,000-to-1 coincidence." "There are no coincidences in our world, Ghost," Jim replied, finally lowering his weapon an inch, though his finger remained firmly on the trigger guard. "You know that better than anyone. 5 years we mourned him. 5 years we bled trying to plug the holes left by the cartel war his death started. If he walked away, he's a traitor. If he's a traitor, he breathes his last breath in this diner today." The next hour was an agonizing, psychological torture. The sun began its slow descent behind the jagged Arizona mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the gravel parking lot. Inside the diner, the air grew thick and stale. The bikers took up tactical positions, 2 by the front windows, concealed behind the faded blinds, 2 at the rear exit, Jim and Ghost remaining in the center aisle. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic humming of the refrigerator units and Stella's desperate, whispered attempts to soothe a crying Lily. Stella's mind raced. Jonathan, she still thought of him as Mark had promised her this life was safe. When he stumbled into her life in Seattle, bleeding and desperate, he had told her everything. He told her about the Hells Angels, the gun-running routes through Nevada, and the terrifying realization that a high-ranking member of his own charter was feeding information to the ATF and the Sinaloa cartel. To protect her and their unborn child, he orchestrated his own fiery demise. He had lived in the shadows ever since, working cash jobs under the table, moving them from town to town every few months. Kingman was supposed to be a long-term haven. Now, his past was sitting in booths 4 and 5, waiting to execute him. "He's not a traitor," Stella suddenly whispered into the silence. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she couldn't stop them. Jim Henderson turned his head slowly. "Excuse me?" "I said, he's not a traitor," Stella repeated, her voice gaining a fractional amount of strength. "He found out someone at your table was a rat. Someone was selling out the club. He knew if he came forward without hard proof, he'd be murdered. So, he ran. To protect us. To protect his family." Tommy Davis emerged from the hallway, scoffing loudly. "Listen to this broad. Johnny spun you a fairy tale to justify abandoning his brothers. He was skimming off the top of the Reno Armory shipments. We all suspected it. When the heat came down, he faked a crash and ran with the cash." "That's a lie!" Stella yelled, tears streaming down her face. "We don't have any money. Look at where I work. We live in a 2-bedroom trailer off the highway. If he stole from you, where is the money, huh?" Tommy took a step forward, his jaw tight. "Watch your mouth, sweetheart, or I'll—" "Shut up, Tommy!" Ghost snapped, his pale eyes narrowing. He looked at Stella, studying her worn uniform, her cheap shoes, the sheer exhaustion etched into her features. She wasn't living like the wife of a millionaire thief. She was living like a refugee. Before Tommy could retort, a sound sliced through the mounting tension. It wasn't the roar of a pack. It was the solitary, heavy thump-thump-thump of a single Harrison-Davidson engine turning off Route 66 and crunching onto the gravel parking lot. Every man in the room tensed. Weapons were raised. The safeties clicked off in unison. Stella squeezed her eyes shut. "Run, Jonathan. Please, God. Just keep riding." But the engine sputtered and died right outside the front door. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. The shadow of a tall, broad-shouldered man fell across the frosted glass of the diner's entrance. The brass bell above the door chimed cheerfully. The man who walked in was wearing a grease-stained mechanic shirt and faded denim jeans. He had a thick, dark beard and a long, jagged scar running from his left temple down to his jawline, a souvenir from a fiery car wreck 5 years prior. He held a small, plastic grocery bag containing a coloring book and a box of crayons. He stopped, dead in his tracks. Jonathan Riley stared down the barrels of 6 firearms. He looked at the leather cuts, the Nevada rockers, and finally, the faces of the men he had bled with, fought with, and fundamentally betrayed. His eyes swept the room, landing on Stella and Lily trembling in the booth. A flicker of pure, unadulterated terror crossed his hardened features, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating calm. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply let the plastic grocery bag slip from his fingers. It hit the linoleum with a soft thud. "Johnny," Ghost whispered. The word sounded like a prayer and a curse combined. He lowered his gun slightly, his hands visibly shaking. "You son of a bitch. You're alive." Jonathan didn't look at his old best friend. He looked directly at Jim Henderson. "Let the woman and the kid walk out the back door, Jim," Jonathan said. His voice was deeper than Stella remembered, scraped raw by years of hiding. "This is between you and me. They have nothing to do with this." "They have everything to do with this," Jim roared, the veins in his thick neck bulging. "You broke the oath, Johnny. You faked your death, let us bury an empty box, and left us to fight the cartel while you played house in the desert. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't put a bullet between your eyes right now." Jonathan took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the guns trained on his chest. "Because," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal baritone, "if you kill me, you'll never find out who's been feeding the feds your transport schedules for the last 6 years." The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the copper skillet felt charged, like the atmosphere right before a lightning strike. "You're blowing smoke, Johnny," Tommy Davis sneered from the back of the room, his gun aimed squarely at Jonathan's head. "You're trying to buy time. You were the rat. You skimmed the Reno cash, you got caught in the middle of a cartel hit, and you ran." Jonathan finally shifted his gaze to Tommy. A cold, humorless smile touched the corner of his scarred mouth. "I wondered how long it would take you to speak up, Tommy," Jonathan said softly. "You always did have a big mouth when the pressure was on." Jim Henderson stepped between them, his massive frame blocking Tommy from Jonathan's view. "Enough games. You claim there's a rat at my table? Prove it. Right here, right now, or you don't leave this diner alive." Jonathan slowly raised his hands, showing his palms to the room. "I need to reach into my back pocket. I have a ledger. Not the club's ledger. The ledger." "Do it slow," Jim commanded, gesturing with his pistol. Jonathan reached back and pulled out a small, black, leather-bound notebook. It looked old and weathered. He tossed it gently onto the nearest table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Ghost. "5 years ago," Jonathan began, his eyes locked on the president, "we had a shipment of AR-15S coming down from Oregon, supposed to be routed through Sacramento, then across the Nevada line. 3 days before the run, the ATF raided the exact warehouse we were using for the transfer. 6 of our brothers went to federal prison." "I remember," Jim growled. "It was a bloodbath." "I was the vice president," Jonathan continued. "I had access to the encrypted phones. I started digging. I found out the raid wasn't based on surveillance. It was an inside tip. Someone gave them the exact GPS coordinates and the padlock combinations." Jonathan pointed a finger at the black notebook. "Open it, Ghost. Look at the date. October 12th, 2021. Ghost, his face pale and tight, picked up the notebook. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the handwritten notes. It's a list of bank routing numbers, offshore accounts, Grand Cayman, Belize. Look at the deposits," Jonathan instructed. "Every single deposit perfectly aligns with a failed club run. The Sacramento raid, the Vegas cartel ambush, the Reno skimming that I supposedly did. Every time the club took a massive loss, 50 grand dropped into those accounts." "So what?" Tommy yelled, taking a step forward, his finger white-knuckling his trigger. "You wrote down some fake bank numbers in a notebook. That proves nothing." "It proves everything," Jonathan said, his voice rising to match Tommy's. "Because before I faked my death, I broke into the sergeant-at-arms locker. I copied the serial numbers of the burner phones bought for the top table. I hired a private hacker to trace the ping locations of the phone that called the ATF tip line in Sacramento." Jonathan locked eyes with Tommy, the hatred burning bright and clear. "The phone pinged from a cell tower directly above a strip club in downtown Vegas," Jonathan stated. "The exact same strip club where Tommy Davis spends every Tuesday night." The exact same strip club where Tommy's sister works as a manager who happens to have a bank account in Belize. The diner went dead still. Jim Henderson slowly turned his head to look at Tommy. The other bikers in the room, previously focused entirely on Jonathan, subtly shifted their stances, their eyes darting toward the wiry man at the back of the room. "He's lying, Jim!" Tommy shouted, genuine panic finally bleeding into his voice. Sweat was pouring down his face now. "He's trying to frame me. I'm your brother. I rode with you for 15 years. Ghost," Jim said, his voice frighteningly calm. "Call the numbers." "Jim, come on," Tommy started, taking a step backward toward the kitchen hallway. "I said call the damn numbers, Albert," Jim roared, the sudden explosion of volume rattling the glass in the windows. Ghost pulled his cell phone from his cut. He dialed a string of numbers from the ledger. The room listened to the digital ringing. A moment later, an automated voice echoed from the phone's speaker. "Welcome to the offshore routing service for Grand Cayman Federal. Please enter your account PIN." Ghost read the 4-digit PIN written next to the account. "Welcome, Thomas Davis. Your current balance is $1,420,000. The automated voice was the loudest sound in the world. The color completely drained from Tommy's face. He looked at Jim, then at Ghost, then at the other 4 bikers whose guns were now slowly turning toward him. The brotherhood, the 15 years of loyalty, vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, brutal reality of motorcycle club justice. "You sold us out to the feds," Jim whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying homicidal rage. "You let 6 brothers rot in a concrete box so you could pad your retirement fund." "Jim, wait. Let me explain." Tommy didn't finish the sentence. He made the fatal mistake of a cornered rat. He whipped his 9mm toward the president, his finger pulling the trigger. He was fast, but Ghost was faster. Before Tommy's gun could fully level, Ghost lunged across the aisle. He didn't fire his weapon. He used his massive body as a battering ram. He slammed into Tommy with the force of a freight train. The gun went off, the deafening crack echoing in the small diner, the bullet shattering the fluorescent light fixture above the counter. Glass rained down in a sparkling, lethal shower. Stella screamed, burying her face into Lily's hair, shielding her from the falling glass. Ghost drove Tommy to the floor, pinning him under 300 pounds of muscle. With a sickening crunch, Ghost brought his heavy steel-toed boot down on Tommy's wrist. Tommy shrieked in agony, his hand spasming and dropping the weapon. In seconds, the other bikers swarmed. Tommy was dragged to his feet, disarmed, bleeding, and surrounded by men who looked ready to tear him apart with their bare hands. Jim Henderson stood perfectly still amid the chaos. He brushed a shard of glass from his leather cut, his chest heaving. He looked at the shattered light, then down at Tommy, and finally, over to Jonathan. Jonathan hadn't moved a muscle. He stood firmly in front of the booth where his wife and daughter were huddled, his body a living shield. Jim slowly holstered his weapon. The definitive click signaled the end of the war. "Get him outside," Jim ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion, pointing at a sobbing Tommy. "Tie him to the back of the lead bike. We have a long ride back to Nevada. He's going to answer to the whole table." The bikers dragged Tommy out the front door, his protests muffled by a heavy leather glove shoved over his mouth. Inside the diner, only Jim, Ghost, Jonathan, and his family remained. Ghost walked over to Jonathan. The 2 giants stood chest to chest. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Ghost reached out and gripped the back of Jonathan's neck, pulling him into a fierce, bone-crushing embrace. "You stupid, stubborn son of a bitch," Ghost choked out, tears finally spilling over his scarred cheeks. "I mourned you. I drank to your ghost for 5 years." "I'm sorry, brother," Jonathan whispered, returning the embrace. "I couldn't risk the club, and I couldn't risk them." He looked over Ghost's shoulder at Stella and Lily. Jim Henderson stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver ring bearing the club's insignia. He held it out to Jonathan. "Your seat at the table is still empty, Johnny," Jim said quietly. "You saved the club today. You come back with us. You wear the patch. You take your rightful place." Jonathan looked at the silver ring. It represented power, brotherhood, and a life of adrenaline and violence. Then, he looked at Stella. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, begging him silently. Lily peeked out from under her mother's arm, her face stained with tears, holding her little purple crayon. Jonathan gently pushed Jim's hand away. "I'm dead, Jim," Jonathan said softly. Jonathan Riley burned in a car crash outside Vegas 5 years ago. Mark Stevens is a mechanic in Arizona. He has a wife. He has a little girl. Jim Henderson stared into Jonathan's eyes for a long time. He saw the finality there, the absolute resolve of a man who had chosen his path. Slowly, the president nodded. He slipped the ring back into his pocket. "I don't know any Mark Stevens," Jim said, his voice gruff, official. "And as far as the Nevada Charter is concerned, the ghosts of the past stay buried in the desert." He turned and walked toward the door. Ghost lingered for a second longer. He looked down at Lily, tapping the weeping angel on his forearm one last time. "You take care of your daddy, little bird," Ghost whispered. He turned and followed his president out into the fading twilight. Engines roared to life, a deafening thunder that shook the diner's foundations. Stella and Jonathan stood in the silence of the copper skillet, listening as the sound faded away down Route 66, leaving them alone, finally and truly free. The story of Jonathan, Stella, and the Hells Angels is a heart-stopping reminder that the past rarely stays buried, and the truth has a funny way of revealing itself in the most unexpected ways, even through the innocent observation of a 4-year-old child. It shows us that true loyalty isn't always about wearing a patch or standing with a crowd. Sometimes, the most profound act of loyalty is walking away to protect the ones you love. Jonathan sacrificed his identity, his brotherhood, and his entire life to keep his family safe from a betrayal he couldn't control. If this dramatic tale of survival, loyalty, and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible story with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life narratives that prove truth is always stranger and more dangerous than fiction. See you in the next video.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, a little girl was beaten and abandoned on Christmas Eve, until a Hells Angels biker saw her. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling in this story was compassion. It's a reminder that even during someone's darkest moment, one person's willingness to care can completely change the direction of a situation. Stories like this encourage us to look beyond appearances and remember that kindness can come from unexpected places. What part of the story stayed with you the longest? And do you think small acts of compassion can have a bigger impact than we often realize? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. One simple takeaway is to pay a little more attention to the people around us. Sometimes offering help, encouragement, or simply noticing someone who may be struggling can make a meaningful difference. Thank you for watching and being part of our community. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and consider liking or subscribing if you'd like to see more stories like this in the future.